Hi,
Hi, Paul.
how are you?
Um, well, I guess I should say that I'm sick. Just to explain that I don't always sound quite this nasal. I mean, I'm fairly nasal, but I think it's exaggerated because I have like the flu. How are
I'm
you doing?
I'm good. I'd just like to keep going on the thread that we were talking about before we said hi to each other. I'm just so grateful that you wanted to talk with me because I've been a big fan of your work since 2018. And I love that your book came out in 2021. Is that the case,
That
2021?
is right. Yeah.
And I think me and I just want to sort of just take a moment so that I can get a sense of who you are and where you come from, because I'm so interested always in people who find themselves in philosophy. It's just
Right.
a strange part of the park. I never studied philosophy, but I have a weird enthusiasm for it. So
Mm,
and so can you just tell me how you found yourself in this part of the park? Like, what
sure.
led you there?
I mean, I think it's funny that, I mean, it's amazing to me that you've never formally studied it because you have obviously not just an enthusiasm for it, which is a great early modern notion, but a real facility for it. I mean, I love reading you write about philosophy. Um, and in particular, um, I love, do I have it here? Yeah, so I'll answer your question in a second, but I really love this book you published.
Oh, good.
Maybe we'll get to talk about that, about Tominaga Nakamoto, the Japanese philosopher, about whom I knew very little before reading this. So how did I find myself in philosophy? Well, so I mean, in terms of family heritage, I'm from India, but I grew up all over. So I was born in the Middle East in Bahrain, and then moved to Taiwan, Singapore, New York, London. And so we were moving around every 3 or 4 years. And I think because of that experience, I was very, very aware, in quite a practical way, of the way in which people's worldviews, languages, concepts, values, just varied quite radically depending on the specifics of family and culture and language, history. And I think as a child, I sort of yearned for a universal language. I wanted to do this thing of standing outside of the relationship between mind and world and look at it from the outside.
Huh.
Um, and and it felt like philosophy was that discipline that aspired to do that thing of standing outside of the relationship of mind to world. But
You
of
re
course, what you
you
discover is that philosophy can't give you that, right? I mean, that's the irony, is that, it aspires constitutively to reflect on the relationship of mind to world, but the only tool with which you have to do that is the mind itself. And so it becomes this um, endlessly kind of iterative, self-reflective practice, but it's a way of, for me, of kind of meditating on the problem of that.
do you remember that feeling of wanting that? Like, do you remember what age you were? I don't want to pry. But yeah, is that something you remember?
Yeah, I mean, I remember, I mean, it accompanies my very earliest memories. So my various earliest memories, and I'm sure this was because I was raised in a sort of vaguely Hindu household. I mean, we weren't particularly religious, but there was some sense of um, there was a kind of structuring Hindu metaphysics, I guess, in the way I was
Yeah,
raised. So
I
I
see.
just thought that the world was an illusion. I just didn't have what some contemporary modern, Anglophone philosophers called, the common Western metaphysic, where you just have objects and human bodies and persons, and that's obviously reality. I just kind of thought, well, this is illusion, this is the Sanskrit word Maya, and reality is something more fundamental, is deeper than that.
I
And
see.
that was my starting point. um and so I was always troubled by what it meant to move around the world as an embodied being, interacting with other embodied beings and other material beings, while also believing or knowing that there was a more kind of fundamental reality, that what didn't involve this kind of separation and this confinement to bodies and objects.
But it's interesting, it's that those intuitions and feelings you had about this led you to study philosophy. People can have those thoughts and then they become an accountant.
Or they become an artist.
Oh yeah, they can be anyone, but you followed those intuitions into that domain. So like how, like what
Yeah,
was
how did that?
it, you know?
So I think I was just lucky with teachers. So when I was in,
Right.
I mean, this is a cliched thing to say, but when I think about how I ended up where I am, the role of different teachers from a very young age just cannot be overstated. And I feel extremely lucky to have been touched by particular teachers. So I had one very formative teacher when I was in my last couple of years of school. It was an English teacher, but he gave me a lot of philosophy to read. And I remember reading Kant with him, and I remember reading Plato with him. And then I went and read more of that stuff when I was in college at Yale. And I just kept on going back to it. I mean, it wasn't that I thought I was going to be an academic. I really didn't, or certainly not an academic philosopher. And I was really fascinated by art history and English and political theory and all of these other disciplines. But somehow there was just the pull of philosophy and these philosophical texts and problems.
You're so right about the people as sort of way stations for our intellectual life. I mean, I can definitely empathize with that, and it actually reminds me of what you wrote about in your piece on genealogical anxiety when you described genealogical luck when you were
Right.
talking about your teacher. That's exactly what I mean. Oh, that's genealogical luck. I think in a way, I don't know, it just reminded me of that. But yeah, I understand that completely.
What's your origin story? We're both very interested in these questions of origins and luckiness and fatedness.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, I feel like I found in you a fellow alien that's been marooned on Earth, and we're trying to make the best of it, basically. Um, my story is I immigrated from Hong Kong to the Midwest,
Right.
and as I was
You grew up
growing
in
up,
Omaha.
yeah,
Right.
and I think growing up, I had the same questions that any sort of preteen had, like, so just basic questions, yeah, will I succeed? Will I die? Am I handsome? Will anyone love me? Just basic questions. And I think I thought I could find the answers in self-help books, but
Huh.
but in the local bookstore in Omaha, the self-help section was right next to the philosophy section, as sometimes bookstores do,
Right. Right.
It's
Sometimes the philosophy section is just a self-help section.
yeah, yeah. I think that's the implication. It's like, here are the serious books, the self.
Right.
But if this isn't serious enough, maybe you can read these too. But it's the same class. And I think I went to the wrong shelf. I should have gotten a self-help book, but I ended up with a philosophy book. And I remember the book. It's The Story of Philosophy by Will Durant. And
Huh.
that was, and I have never looked back since. I've been poisoned ever since. And it's interesting thinking back. I found that my copy of The Story of Philosophy, years ago, and I noticed what I underlined. And
Mm.
it's interesting how it shaped. I mean, talk about teachers shaping us, because I got the sense from my old copy that the people that I enjoyed reading later on were the people that Durant
Mm.
wrote sort of more open-heartedly about, you know. So he loved Kant. So
Mm,
in a way, I loved Kant. He didn't have feelings for Nietzsche. So I
right.
didn't have feelings for Nietzsche
Right.
for very long. It's so interesting seeing that. But in a way, I think those basic questions that you had when you were young, I didn't have those kinds, but I had similar basic questions. And I
Mm,
thought for some reason philosophy would help me illuminate them. And
mm,
I think you're right, they don't really. But I've ended up to a point where it's just fun. Like I like
mm.
reading men and women who think that they can figure it all out. It's
Yes.
just, the great drama and comedy of it is just, there's nothing better, it seems to me. I mean, is that true? I don't know, but that might be an exaggeration, but I think you catch my drift, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I like the idea. I I like the idea that you were looking for a self-help book and accidentally got to the philosophy section because um the philosophy, or at least an area, a period of philosophy that you and I are both kind of obsessed with, the ancient Greek tradition, uh, really just didn't see a distinction between those two categories. Um, and it's only philosophy since really, the late 19th century. Um, I mean, arguably with Kant a bit earlier, uh, where we start to see philosophy as just this like purely theoretical
Mm,
enterprise that isn't supposed to be like deeply entangled with questions about how we as individual people ought to live.
mm,
Um, and some of those questions, I think I sounded very grandiose when I was talking about the relationship of mind to world, but I was also totally preoccupied by questions of, was anyone going to love me? Was I capable of loving anyone? I mean, I
mm,
think one of the big questions that also started to worry me as I got into adolescence, and actually relates to this thing we were talking about earlier about other bodies and proximity and illness and community, was, how do I reconcile that this very strong commitment I had, this kind of political commitment I had to a kind of universal egalitarianism that was genuinely embracing of everyone, with my kind of instinctive desire to recoil from people. I mean, now I know that that's a wonderfully thematized idea in someone like the poet Walt Whitman, right? The great poet of American democracy, who is sort of best known for exalting uh, um, these experiences of identification with the other and every possible other, but then also has these moments of dramatic recoil.
mm.
Um, and, I don't think there's an answer to that problem in the sense of a kind of theoretical answer, but I think philosophy at its best, or at least its most interesting, as you said, is a drama, right? Dramatizes these problems in a way that makes us sort of feel their depth and contours and universality.
I would love to talk with you for like 17 days on the Greeks. But what you just said about philosophy after the 19th century, more or less, and about how they were more theoretical than, say, a kind of praxis, reminds me a lot of one of the things that I was most grateful for about your book, which
Mm,
was they really renewed for me a sense of interest to certain thinkers who I never thought of as philosophers,
mm,
and I'm thinking specifically of like Catherine McKinnon and
right.
Andrew Dworkin. And, reading your piece on genealogical anxiety and how you write about McKinnon was really interesting to me.
Mm,
And so, it make it, what I sense is um, that you are giving her due as a philosopher.
mm,
I have never thought of her as a philosopher. I mean,
mm,
I don't know how you feel about Dworkin, but both of
mm.
those figures I remember in my youth. I remember seeing Andrea Dworkin on the Phil Donahue show,
Yes,
and
it's an extraordinary appearance.
it was horrifying.
Yeah.
I remember the crowd and the host being so, there's so much animus.
Yes.
And I didn't understand. I was too young to really understand the animus. I kind of understood what they were, but that's what I remember most,
Mm,
and it was horrifying.
mm,
But can you talk a little bit about um, uh, y bringing these people, McKinnon specifically for me, but perhaps others, into a relationship with philosophy so that we naturally think of them as philosophers? Because
mm,
that was a really interesting to me.
mm.
Or is that the case for you?
Yeah, no, it absolutely is the case for me. I mean, one thing to say is I don't get too hung up anymore on the question of whether something is or is not philosophy, including my own work. I mean, I think that was a very big question for me when I was younger, when I was in graduate school and just kind of starting out in the discipline. My identity as a philosopher or someone who sometimes did non-philosophy was a matter of concern, right? And now I just like the feeling of being like a thinker and a writer. And I'm actually very interested to know how you think about yourself in that way. Obviously, you're a formidable artist, but you just range across so many mediums, and you're also a beautiful writer and speaker. And I wonder if what sort of category is the most capacious one that you like to use. But that all said, one thing I think I'm trying to do in that book, in The Right to Sex, is take these feminist thinkers from the 70s and 80s with like dead philosophical seriousness, and I try and write about them and think with them in the same way I write about and think with Plato or
Right.
Nietzsche. And in fact, I teach them the same way. I mean, one of the things I love about McKinnon's text, and there's a lot to say about McKinnon, um, as in terms of her substantive feminist politics, much of which I disagree with, but in terms of her as a thinker and a writer, I mean, she's just so powerful. There's so
Right.
much going on. There's so much creative energy. There's so much imagination. There's so much rebellion against convention, but also the reappropriation of various kinds of rhetorical conventions and theoretical conventions for like novel purposes. It feels, if you really spend time with these texts, as thrilling, I think, as it feels to spend time with any of the great canonical philosophers. And when I teach McKinnon or Shulamith Firestone or Audre Lorde, I mean, that's what I try and get students to feel is, these texts can take the full weight of all of your attention, and that they can kind of come alive and do interesting, sophisticated, extraordinary things. And that was my experience, because I had a kind of second intellectual awakening when I started reading feminist theory
Mm.
in graduate school, not as not in my capacity as a student. No one was teaching this to me. I was barely taught by any women at either the undergraduate or graduate level, but just on the side. It was like a secret little side project. And I remember just the feeling of these texts speaking to something deep and foundational. And when you haven't read in the history of feminism, you can kind of think what feminism is about, and you think it's about like the equality of women and men, and it's against discrimination, and you don't think it's going to be thrilling.
Right.
You
Right.
don't think it's going to be dizzying, and the things that philosophy is at its best. So that's what I found
See,
in
that's so interesting because it's I don't know how other people feel about it, but I think McKinnon and Dworkin and others, from what I know, they became iconic in a way. And when you're an icon, no one thinks about what you actually thought.
right.
I mean, and I think my experience with publishing a book on interviews with Marcel Duchamp, I think
Mm,
was my experience of understanding that because every
mm,
every artist knows who Marcel Duchamp is. Um, but but because he's an icon, no one actually thinks about what he did or what he thought about, right?
right.
And the experience of publishing those interviews made me realize how little I knew about
Mm,
him. It was a real, that was my awakening. I mean, he's still not one of my favorite artists, but he
mm,
was such an interesting, weird person. You
mm,
would never know that because he's an icon. right?
And because he's an icon, he is already metabolized and read and falsely thought to be totally known.
Yes, yes. The false knowingness is, I think, what reminded me of when you were sort of reintroducing me to something like McKinnon. You know, I didn't know. You know, I think your piece on genealogical anxiety and some of the things you quote about her reminded me a lot of Adorno. Her idea
Yes.
of
Yeah.
the impossibility of a totalizing feminist outlook being a good thing as opposed to a bad thing, to me is completely Adornian. And it was interesting to see the kind of the familial resemblances, right?
Right.
And not realizing that, oh, there's simply a familial resemblance. It never occurred to me. It never occurred to me. I mean, I never knew because she was an icon. I never read her. So it's
Right.
super cool.
Oh, thanks. Could I ask you a question, since we've been talking about the question of sort of genealogy and origins? And I was really struck by I think it was a comment you made in a lecture of yours I was watching. I've really enjoyed doing a very deep dive into your archive. And, you know, because we obviously have this kind of mutual preoccupation with origins and fate and determination and originality. And so I think in the lecture you were talking about your abandonment, if that's the right word, or like the hiatus you took, right, from digital art making. And you said that in taking that hiatus, you were fighting against your own fate, right? Because everything, all of the kind of material conditions and that had produced you as this kind of digital artist. And then you start this thing from ex nihilo, this breathers project, this project of creating these air sculptures, in which you are doing a kind of physical animation in a more literal way, right? Going back to the Greek etymology of anima, you are giving souls to these persons, these objects. And so like positing yourself as this origin point, right? You become this kind of godlike figure creating them. And so I'm interested in how you think as an artist about the problem of fate and determination on one hand, and then novelty on the other. I mean, do you feel yourself? I mean, I'm kind of interested in the phenomenology of being you. Do you feel yourself like to be, what does it feel like to create something ex nihilo or to be an origin point? Or do you always feel somehow like you're gathering fragments from your own past and other past and bringing them together in new ways?
Oh man, this is like another 17 days of talking. And before I just want to pin the ex nihilo part because I just read an old dissertation about the history of creatio ex nihilo, and it's completely fascinating. It's completely fascinating insofar as its historical origins as a second century notion in early Christian cults, and who used it and who it was used against. That was the most interesting part because it because in a student online talk I did, one of the questions was like related to the idea of how new is something, right? Is it absolutely new? Is it really, like, what does it mean to make something new?
Right.
But what was interesting is what underwrote that notion, and what underwrote the notion in my intuition was the idea that what is new takes no time. That it's timeless and it takes no time. And so that's the intuition that for something to be absolutely new, it had to be timeless and takes no time. And that connects to me this historical relationship to creatio ex nihilo. It's not complicated. It's godlike. It's the feeling that you can create just like God.
Yes.
Because God exists outside time, right? It's like, oh, I should be like God. I should do this. I can't say that I create like God, but I can say that I think the notion of fate that you talk about is, I think, something that I only thought about when I was incredibly unhappy. I
Mm.
think, I think I had a great run of things in contemporary art after 9/11, before the global recession. I hate to put our time frames on catastrophe, but that's basically what it is. And but I think in a way, I, I could feel my sensory capacities being deprived because of the path I was on.
Mm.
I don't know how else to describe it. It's that it's that as an artist, you're very lucky, and I'm very grateful for all the opportunities I've had showing and making a living off of my work, and sort of having control of my own time, which is truly the thing that I care about most.
Mm.
But at a certain point, I realized not only did I have no control over my own time, but that the way in which I was running my life and perhaps my studio was depriving my senses. And
Mm.
I think this is we can, and I think we can. There could, I'm sure there's 7, 8 symposiums that can happen about around the idea of notions of production and
Mm.
notions of conventionally what we call success and notions of sensory deprivation. I think, and I think so. I felt sensory deprived. So I think in a way, I felt like the notion that I should keep making the things I was making and following a path to what we nominally call successful was depriving my senses of being able to tell what real empirical reality was.
And how much of that had to do with the logic of the screen?
A lot. I think it sort of it's we need a, I mean, I will be a vulgar Freudian and say the screen was the screen image. And
Yeah.
I had to recognize it as such. That's what I recognize. And so if it's the screen image, then what are the like what exactly is going on, right? So in a way, the screen, what I talk about in terms of reaching peak screen and not wanting to look at the screen anymore, I think is true as far as it goes. But clearly, the screen for all of us now represents something else, just like the
Mm.
screen represented for me back then something else. And what that is, is different. But I
Mm.
think we can all, I think generally, maybe we can all agree that the screen, like you've written, a kind of mediation that might reduce our capacities, whatever they may be. For me, it's certainly a reduction of sensory capacities insofar as I think that our Aristotelian senses is only one aspect of the
Mm.
battery of senses that we have to tell what our reality truly is. I need to believe, I want to believe, and I believe in the notion that our sensory capacities are certainly more than the big five.
Mm.
And, and I think it's just true, scientifically speaking. So, and I certainly feel it. So, cheating fate and dodging fate of me being a successful artist, quote unquote, meant listening to those senses, I suppose.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
No, I think it really does. I mean, one further sense we have is, that capacity that allows us to recognize the other, right? Not just as simply a body or an object in front of us, but as another center of consciousness that demands moral response and ethical response. And my experience of teaching on the screen for the better part of 2 years was that response, which is already something that is not just totally automatic all of the time, and you have to kind of remind yourself of, I think, becomes harder on when you're mediated by the screen. Everything starts to feel a bit like a video game, even like responding to your students' questions. And so, on one hand, yes, we can communicate with many more people. Like, it's amazing that you're sitting, I take it, in New York, I'm sitting in Oxford. We don't even need to know where the other is, and we're having this conversation, and this is wonderful. But I know I'm going to come away from this wanting to see you in person. Like, I want us to be two bodies in the same room. And that's interesting, right? There's obviously something more that is wanted and is and is needed. Yeah, so I think that makes perfect sense. Can I ask you, so you had that, I loved what you said about something timeless and created that doesn't take time, right? But I was uh that made me think about the very long process that went into, for you, the production of your breathers. So you describe how for one of them, I think your first one, you had something like 40 something prototypes, and it was this like slow iterative process, which was just fascinating to hear you describe. I mean, I don't know if you know that you make this kind of Socratic gesture again and again when you describe that process. So, you're talking about how what you needed to know was, you needed to know some physics, you needed to know some aerodynamics, you needed to know some stuff about, tailoring and stitching and these things. And you just keep on saying, I still don't know that stuff. I still don't know it. I still don't know it. And it reminded me of this very kind of Socratic gesture of denying knowledge that you clearly have, because part of what that process has produced is maybe not a theoretical grasp of those things, but know-how, right? But the other thing I found amazing about listening to you describe that process was, you would put a prototype on the screen and it would move in this way that was like evocative and affecting and very kind of visually striking. And then you would say, better, but still not right. And the certainty of your judgment of it's not being right, I found really fascinating, because what you didn't mean there, I take it, was it's not a perfect copy of what a human would look like, because that's not what you were going for. You weren't trying to create these kind of perfectly veridical, mimetic copies. But there was some other kind of norm there, some other kind of ideal of getting it right. And that's really interesting to me, because I'm interested in this question of what it means to get something right when what you're not trying to do is just make a copy of reality. Because I think philosophy is like that. I mean, some philosophers, maybe most philosophers, think that what they're doing in philosophy is trying to create a copy of reality, right? They're trying to just perfectly describe some aspect of reality. But I don't know, I feel often when I'm writing philosophy, that's not really what I'm doing. I'm doing something else, maybe something more creative, but there's still a notion of getting it right. But the notion isn't like trying to copy reality, but still nonetheless about maybe having some particular effect or producing something that is of a certain kind of use to someone or does something. So yeah, I'm interested in how you think of the question of getting it right.
Oh man, another 18 days. I think the shorthand way of talking about it is that when I say that it's not right, what I really mean is that I still recognize it. That in a way, and I've talked about this before, I feel like the best of my works that I think are the best are the ones that feel as if I couldn't have made it, that it couldn't have been me, that when I look at it with a kind of incredulity, not that it's great, not that it's awesome, but that there's no way I could have done that. Like, what is it? That's the second exclamation point. I think I feel like I know when it's right, when I can say to myself, who made this and what is it? And so, and in a way, I learned that from making things and having to follow the method. I had to invent the methodologies of the making. I'm very fond of the idea that, what I make remakes me. And I believe that. I think the best of the work that I feel is the best, I'm no longer the same person after making it. And I think intellectually, emotionally, it's hard to know where it comes from. I kind of know. I think I'm an asshole. And I think reality confounds me. And I want to recreate the sense of confoundment in work, maybe. But intellectually, I learned a lot of that from Adorno. I think Adorno becomes, for me, a real key to making space for being able to think dialectically, not to be too academic about it, but also to think in a way so that contradictions are not immediately threatening.
Yes.
right? It reminds me a lot of how you quoted McKinnon. I was really moved by the quote that you had about her talking about the impossibility of the outlook being an important aspect. That's, to me, completely Adornian. And I've learned a lot from that outlook. And because I think if we were to be serious about our situation on this dumbass planet, it's that not everything makes sense. And the things that make sense shouldn't.
That's
And
right.
if we were truly aware, using all of our sensory capacities and perhaps leaning on the sensory capacities of people that we trust and admire, it 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 just simply is contradictory. That's just what it is. That's just what life is. I mean, Adorno's great quote is the whole is the false. And and I don't know if anyone can truly live like that day to day. I don't know. It's a good question. But I don't know how any reasonable, commonsensical, decent person can be on this earth and think everything makes sense, you know? And so, but I think the question becomes, can we make room in ourselves within our work, with our intellectual life, our emotional life? Can we make room for things that are foreign, contradictory, without feeling them being immediately threatening? Think that's all. It's the time thing. It's, can we just make a little more time for ourselves so that when we see something that's not like us, right, that we don't immediately recognize, can we not say immediately, oh, that's threatening? And if we give ourselves enough time, what else can happen? I mean, that's a question, right? And I think I learned that in art. I learned that from seeing works that are confounding, that are alien looking, that it's like there's no reason why they should exist. Like everyone's experience with their parents, maybe with their cousin or whoever, friends, going to contemporary art gallery museums, like, what the fuck is this? Why is this here? I could make this. And that's a legitimate experience, right? That's a very common experience, frankly. But then the question becomes, is it, if that's the tension, can something be made of that tension? Yeah, I think that's right. It's probably wrong. I don't know.
Well, I mean,
Oh, but I wanted to ask you one thing before we
yeah,
go on.
please.
The notion that the best thoughts are the timeless thoughts and that they should come instantaneously, I feel like I learned from philosophy, and I think it's poisoned me. And it took me years to realize that the best thoughts actually take time. But where does that come from? Is that like it's like an undergraduate philosophy question?
No, that's a really interesting question. So I suppose there's this thought that philosophical knowledge rather than empirical or scientific knowledge is the sort of thing that doesn't involve going out into the world, right? So it doesn't, which takes time. I mean, moving through the world is an essentially temporal process. And at least in the ideal of philosophy that we basically get from Plato, mere reflection on the nature of reality will serve up, if your reason machine is working well, will serve up the truth. And that in principle, but I also take it that, that in principle is something that could be instantaneous, right? I think is the thought. Like, it's not something, you're not discovering contingencies, right? So you're not finding out whether, where squirrels hide their nuts and how often, what percentage of them they lose. Fascinating question. It turns out they lose a lot of them. That's not a philosophical question though, because it's not the kind of thing you can just answer by just, the sheer power of instantaneous thought. But of course, and this is interesting, philosophy, all good philosophy, in fact, does take a lot of time, right? It takes a huge amount of time.
Any good thought, any good feeling takes time, right? And I feel like I feel like the ideology of Beck's thoughts being divine, connected to the divine via
Yeah.
timelessness and outside of time. Like, I wasted years thinking that. That was terrible.
I mean, I think the thing is that's difficult is, I think you have to leave some room in like our discourse about creation and creativity and thinking and ideas for the notion of like external inspiration, right? The feeling of something just having struck you, coming as if from outside, as but of course that's just the first part of it, right? Because you get some brilliant idea and then it turns out that when you try and materialize it, whether that's in text or in sculpture, that you don't really have a grasp on it. And this is what I often say to my students, is that they'll say, oh, I know what it is I want to say, I just don't know how to say it. And I say to them, if you don't know how to say it, you don't really know what it is you want to say. Like that method, that laborious method of finding a form of expression adequate to this proto-thought, this kind of feeling, this moment of inspiration, like that is the hard work of philosophy. But that's what really distinguishes, I think, the best philosophers. It's both things. Like you have to be able to see the world in novel and interesting ways, but you also have to be willing to kind of bear down on the limited tools we have of language or materiality, and find ways of communicating, right? Because that's the essential thing we're thinking about here is, how does one go from that private moment of exaltation, right, and inspiration, to a public moment of expression and understanding?
Yeah, it reminds me of what you talk about in terms of world making in your piece. I really felt a kind of familiarity with you bringing it up in relations to art. You actually use the phrase "the creative act."
Yeah.
Really took note of, and it's so. Yeah, so I completely understand. I hear you about that, and it was great to read that you bring up the notion of world making and the way you describe it, and how similar in kind I feel art making is. That was
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm interested in the notion of world making is precisely that thing that philosophy on its official self-conception claims not to do, right? Which is, philosophy claims officially to only describe the world as it is. But of course, when we read the great philosophers, whether that's Plato or McKinnon or Adorno, we also realize that part of what they're doing is creating new languages, new ideas, new frames, and thereby bringing into existence new possibilities. But whether or not those possibilities get realized, right, whether or not people take up the kind of forms of life that Plato or Adorno or McKinnon are offering us, will depend on how effectively they can communicate, right? How the extent to which those new ideas or those new ways of seeing just kind of are intelligible to and kind of make sense to and are emotionally and intellectually attractive to people. But this takes us back to, I just wanted to say this final thing about your comments earlier about dialectics. And it's true that that's a kind of philosophical, theoretical term of art. But one thing I think, especially on the back of writing The Right to Sex, is that, so-called ordinary people have a lot more time for kind of complexity and contradictoriness and ambivalence and, dialectics than we often think, and that's represented on social media. I mean, that's another way in which the screen, I think, is distorting and takes us away from like the full sensitivity of our sensory capacities and intellectual capacities. But, I've found that despite all of these, I think justified observations about the polarization of opinion and political opinion, that there's a huge amount of appetite from people for you to say things like, these issues are really thickety. And the answer is often
say that word again. Thickety, is that what you
thickety? I don't think it's in the dictionary, or maybe it's in my dictionary, but it's a thicket. It's complex, and And the answer often is not that something is wholly good or wholly bad, but that it's both, that a practice is both liberatory and potentially authoritarian, that I mean, to take a concrete, example, that, the introduction of women to work is both good, but also stabilizes patriarchal capitalism, right? Like, this is just how actual social reality works. It's everything is both and. And I think a lot of people want that kind of analysis. And
Yeah,
that's also a place for art.
yeah, I think that's where, that's where, honestly, that's where I started paying attention to your work, and it's just from the London Review of Books, but also reading your book, it strikes me that not only are you not afraid of these contradictions, but that you have a real aesthetic, in particular, about how you start text. And now that I remember, I wanted to ask you, because there's something very gripping about how you start your text. And your texts are gripping in many ways, the historical sort of experience of philosophy in relation to what you're writing about, the feminist experience, feminist history in relation to what's happening to us. It's just very illuminating. But what struck me a lot was how you start the text and how interesting they're gripping. They're really, it's gripping. Like the conspiracy against men, how you start it is completely gripping. Also, I read your piece on pronouns. And it's super interesting about how you were mispronounced twice. And so maybe this is maybe an aesthetic question. Like, where does that craft come from? I mean, do you feel like that? Do you feel like you really craft the first how you enter your text? Because it strikes me that it's very effective.
Well, that's really nice to hear. And I recognize the phenomenon you're talking about, but I think the truth is that is one of the things I don't really think about, and it just kind of comes to me.
Huh.
I mean, so usually I always know where I'm going to begin. I don't often know where I'm going to go or end up, but it's the beginning that kind of comes to me first. As not as a hook so much, but like as an illustration of like the deep problem that I want to get at.
Right. Maybe that's what it is. There's something very concrete about it. There's a concretization of the dilemma. I don't know if dilemma is the right word, but it's just gripping. It's just like
One thing I don't, so obviously, as you know, contemporary Anglophone analytic philosophy makes a very big, or rather, methodologically, the thought experiment plays a very central role. So, but the examples tend to be incredibly far-fetcat and gerrymandered, brains and vats, or like, a trolley and you're pushing overweight people off fat people off, it's just all very weird. And I've never liked that. Like, I'll play that game if I need to, and I know how to do it. But I've always thought that must be better ways for bringing in like the stuff of life into philosophy. And so maybe what's happening at the beginning of those essays is a kind of reaction formation against my philosophical training. It's a kind of refusal to open with a thought experiment, which would be the standard way of doing it, and instead training our attention to something real.
I see. I see. I see. I see. Yeah, those thought experiments are crazy. It's really, I'm truly a philosophical poser, but like I've read more examples about teleportation academic articles than I care to ever admit. It's just
But
crazy.
they're fun. They're really fun. They're fun to teach.
Are they useful? Do you feel like they're useful? I mean, is that an unfair question? Yeah, it's an unfair question, but
no, I mean, okay. So I think they're very useful for, okay, it depends on what you think the project of philosophy is. So if you think that the project of philosophy is just organizing in as kind of simple and elegant a model as possible, our intuitions, our kind of pre-theoretic feelings about things, then thought experiments are great. Because thought experiments are, as the name suggests, a great way of eliciting people's intuitions. And so you can test different principles. But if you just don't buy that picture of philosophy, and I don't really buy that picture, in part because I just think, well, why should we start from our intuitions, And that picture also presupposes that we all just share this common stock of intuitions.
Right.
And I remember, going to the opening session of a metaphysics class when I was an undergraduate at Yale. And, I was told by the professor, look, we're all just going to proceed from the common Western metaphysic, where we just think that there are individual objects and persons. And then we're going to, think about what kind of metaphysical theories we can generate that will be consistent with that picture of things, plus the picture that physics gives us. But that wasn't my baseline. I mean, I was starting from the common sense that this was all illusion. So I was like, I didn't know how I was supposed to play this metaphysics game. Right. So I think that thought experiments are really good for the thing that a lot of philosophers want to do. But I guess I am skeptical sometimes of whether that's how useful of a project that is.
I see.
Because it's essentially conservative. It's about, and I don't mean politically conservative. I mean, it's the whole point of it is to conserve as much as possible how we already see the world and make it free of contradiction. And the kind of philosophy I love is the kind of philosophy that embraces ambivalence and contradiction and sort of, as you said, like makes it more bearable.
Yeah, because it feels more real. Right, it tracks with our it tracks with my sense of empirical reality, and there's no, not being in the world of philosophy, just being in the world. It just seems important to acknowledge the irreconcilability of certain things, and our capacity to simply acknowledge those things goes a long ways towards being able to not only bear them, but to find ways through them, I suppose.
I do, and I agree.
Can I just ask you about the work that you're doing now?
Sure.
I'd just be so curious, because you're writing a book on origins, right? And piggybacking off of the piece that I read of yours on genealogical anxiety. Do you mind telling me?
Yeah, no, I'd be thrilled to talk about it. So this phrase that we've been using, this phrase of genealogical anxiety, it's this phrase I use to pick out this worry we have, that humans have, or at least some humans have, when we uncover the kind of contingent origins of our values or our concepts or our beliefs. Or practices. So, for example, what happens when you grow up religious and then you go out into the world and you realize that the only reason you have the religious beliefs you do is because you grew up in the particular kind of religious family you have, right? And for many people, that prompts a kind of crisis of faith. Or similarly, we have evolutionary biologists telling us that, morality is basically an adaptive mechanism for the reproduction of the species, right? And that intuitively can cast doubt on the authority of morality. But these kind of concerns about the origins of things have been, humans have had those concerns from the beginning of recorded history. So one of my favorite examples, to go back to the Greeks, is from the 6th century Greek poet, philosopher Xenophanes, who was attacking Greek religion. In particular, he disliked the poetic tradition of Homer and Hesiod, which said that the gods had human form. And what Xenophanes said was that, if horses and cattle had hands with which to paint, they would paint their gods in their form, horses like horses, cattle like cattle. And the implication there is that the origin of religious belief isn't like divine revelation or knowledge, but just narcissism. It's just like the projection of ourselves onto the world. which then results in the artistic and aesthetic depiction of ourselves projected onto the world. And so that's what the problematic at the center of the book is just, what do we do when we uncover the contingent origins of everything we believe and hold dear? Like, where do we go from there?
Yeah. I had so many thoughts when you were telling me about this over email. But I think immediately to Adorno's idea of seignorial rights. His lectures on metaphysics, I think, was something that I really thought about, and it's super interesting. I mean, what you're writing about, because it relates to just relates to so much I'm interested in.
What are you working on now?
I'm actually recovering from a cold.
Okay.
I'm working on that.
Good.
I don't. What am I doing? I'm working on a set of crochet figures with my mom that details American fraudsters, like
Wow.
Sam Bankman-Fried.
Oh, one of my favorite fraudsters.
It's I love doing that. I think I just finished writing a piece on my experience programming my own AI self-portrait, and the piece is called "Sympathy for the Devil and the Machine." That'll come out in May. And I'm working on new breathers. I just want new unrealized movements. I just want new unrealized movements. And so that's as good as it gets, really.
That sounds amazing.
Um, this has been so fun, and I'm so
Really
grateful.
great.
And
No, I'm grateful. Thank you so much for asking me to do this.
I hope we keep the conversation. I hope we keep up the conversation at some point. But really, I really appreciate this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. Take care.